These are your superpowers, positive character strengths. You have them, all of them, some more than others.
What we are best suited to do in our lives connects with who we are and our character strengths.
Standing up strong, activating your superpowers is how you can change the world.
And you're pioneering the future of humanity.
Let's start right now. On today's episode, we have a great conversation with character strength expert Dr. Roger Bretherton. Roger is a psychology professor at the University of Lincoln in England, and we talked with him about his work applying strengths in a wide variety of settings and how good things follow when we go into each of our days with our top strengths in mind. So we're so excited to be having this conversation today with Dr. Roger Bretherton, who is joining us from all the way across the pond, as they say, in the UK. And who has a real specialty in this idea of the way our strengths ripple. See what I did there? Ripple through social networks, and how really, we're just often one piece of a much broader system of impact and of strength because of the way these things can work together and can inspire other acts and strength downstream. So before we get into all the science behind that, because I want you to unpack that for us, I just want to welcome you, and I'd love to hear more about your story and your journey to this work and why you find it so meaningful.
Thank you, Jackie. Well, it's an absolute pleasure to be with you. And I think maybe if I start with some of my background, really. So I started off as a clinical psychologist working here in the UK. And I was working with, in my sort of early to mid 20s, working with some of the most severe cases that kind of get referred to psychiatric services here. So many of them would be diagnosed with personality disorders. Many would have been through very extreme trauma of various kinds. Many would be chronically suicidal or self-harming. So this really sort of high risk, sort of difficult area to work with people, but actually very, very rewarding and very exciting to work with them, because you see people who look like they're going to self-destruct their lives really turn around over a period of time if you're given the time to work with them. And what I noticed during the decade or so that I was working in those services was that the questions I was starting to ask about people started to change. So instead of saying, what's wrong with this person, I started to ask the question, what is this person missing? What's the good thing that this person could learn that would really make the difference? Do they need a bit of social intelligence or some creativity or a bit of persistence or some wisdom? Do they need a bit of courage to have a conversation they're struggling to have? And so sort of develop this sort of idea that we can begin to teach people strengths rather than going, what's wrong with you? How do we fix it? We go, what are the seeds of what's right with you, and how could we really, really make that work? And that particularly came with the people that I was working with trauma, that I often found once they got past that acute clinical phase of trauma, flashbacks, nightmares, all those kind of things. Once they got past that, very often I noticed they started to say, well, I'm developing more compassion. I'm developing a sense of justice. I want to make a community contribution. And so even in those sort of very early days of me working in clinical practice, I was starting to get this sense of there's something more here. And that's the area I work in now. So now I work in something called character strengths and virtues, which is really the study of the good qualities of character that make life worth living.
Wow. So I can imagine how rewarding that is, to be able to watch someone go from a place of such darkness to a place of such purpose. It reminds me a lot of actually our whole mission and our museum here in Cincinnati, which is grounded in these stories that come miraculously out of the darkest chapter of history, right? Arguably. People who experience the depths of human depravity and terror and trauma, who landed in Cincinnati, Ohio, at Union Terminal, and what was it about them that allowed them, right, to lean into this next chapter in a way that built literally built our museum. It was the survivors who came together and said, we have an opportunity here. And
Yeah.
so I see why it's so fascinating and so rewarding to work at the intersection of someone's traumatic experience and like what is it about the transformation and that shift, right?
Mm.
The planting of those sort of seeds of what's right that can actually transform something that's been so awful into this amazing beacon of light. And so
Yeah.
that's, yeah, I can totally relate to how we think about our work. People are always surprised when they come to the museum because they think they're in for a really dark experience, and and yes, the history is horrifically dark and we don't shy away from those things, but really, folks leave feeling this incredible sense of purpose and hope and potential. And
Mm.
so the fact that you get to do that every day in a different way is really cool, also. Um, can you talk a little bit about it seems to me that like how do you do that? How do you actually get somebody who's so anchored in a space of trauma and we know that trauma can, if it's not, if you're not thinking about it in a productive way in that transition moment, that actually it can really drag you down.
Mm.
How do you work with people who, are struggling to get them to like pivot into a place of abundance and potential?
Yeah. I'd usually view it as sort of two processes, really. So I think the first process is, I mean, I'm a positive psychologist, so I study the good things about people, but I always say that doesn't mean I'm negative phobic, so I'm not going to avoid all the sort of bad stuff in the world. And so when I was working with trauma, particularly, I'd sort of say there were sort of two processes involved, really. One is the process that, if you like, gets people from traumatized, if you like, back to normal, like back to functioning again in everyday life. And very often that was a sort of process of processing, really, that very often kind of traumatic memories, traumatic experiences, we hold them in our bodies, we process them in certain places in the mind. And you're trying to get people back to a point where really, really, I mean, it understates it to say that these are difficult experiences that people have had, where those memories that seem to be like a different quality of memory, if your memory was a filing system, it feels like a file that won't fit in any particularly normal box.
Mm.
That they become normal. Not normal in the sense that they're okay, but they become, this is now part of my story.
Manageable.
This is part
Yeah.
of my life. Yeah, it belongs. So that's the first piece. And then the positive piece, the sort of moving on from there, is the bit when you then start actively reflecting on what have you now learned? Where have you grown? How do you see the world differently as a result? And I will sometimes find people will describe it. They will say, I've gone from being a victim to being a survivor, and from being a survivor to being a contributor. And it's almost like,
Yeah.
I don't think you can jump from one right to the end, but I think you can take those small steps. That means when you find a place of healing and integration, you can begin to think, how can I bring this to other people now in my world?
Yeah. Yeah, it's so special to think, like I said, about that in the context of our work and our survivor community. And in fact, I'm thinking of a quote from one of our survivors, Werner Koppel, who survived a death march out of Auschwitz, and came to Union Terminal. Arrived. His quote, and I'm not going to do it justice, but it's the gist of it is, I arrived with a wife and a baby and a suitcase, and that ended the first part of my life or started the next part of
Mm.
my life.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so even the fact that he got to a place where he was able to reflect on it and, to your point, accept it as, a file among other files in his sort of memory of and his experiences allowed him, I think you're right. And also this idea of purpose and contribution and moving from just having survived it to actually finding a purpose in the next chapter. His story is really powerful because he was sort of moved to action. He was the first survivor in Cincinnati to
Mm.
tell his story publicly. We
Wow.
think about this history like it's ancient history, and while some time has passed since it happened, the field that emerged around telling these stories is relatively young, right? And
Mm.
so people who are still living in our lifetimes, and Warner's no longer with us, but many folks who obviously were his contemporaries are, um, you know, was only in the last 20, 30 years that people started saying, what does it look like to remember this history and to
Yeah.
talk about it in a way that's going to move us forward? So he was the first to do that, and he did it because he was triggered by an op-ed in our local newspaper. It was a paid editorial, I think, or a section in the newspaper where someone denied the Holocaust and denied the legitimacy of what had happened. And the Diary of Anne Frank called it a fake. And he just stood up. He said, "I can't. He found sort of this moment of purpose, right, and became
Yeah.
a contributor.
Yeah.
That's so fascinating.
Yeah.
How is this? In the sort of the science of character strengths, there's this whole idea of towing, right? And sort of how do we cultivate strengths that aren't quite as natural for us? Or to your point, what's missing? Like, where am I not activating my potential, or what do I need to call up to do that?
Yeah.
Do you? I'm watching you smile, so I'm assuming that this is something that you did work on every day, and this is
Yeah.
exactly what you're talking about. But tell us a little bit more about how that phenomenon plays out in your work.
Yeah. So a lot of my work now will be researching all kinds of fields. So I'm researching and practicing a lot along lots of kind of large organizations. I was just telling you before we started that I've just finished doing a big piece of research on coaching in the prison population.
Mm.
I'm very much doing exactly what you're saying. So that sort of idea is, firstly, if you want to develop character strengths, you don't spend your time going, oh no, where are they? What's happened to me? You say, what are they? When have I used them? So in a sense, you're using a seed model approach to your character strengths.
Mm.
So if you complete a psychometric, or you get friends to tell you, or you just observe your experience a little bit, you spot that you're using hope, courage, creativity, persistence, love, whatever your things are, you're using them already to some extent. And the question is, how do you bring attention to those things, and how do you then begin to develop them more? So by being attentive to them. The reason we have to sort of look at it that way is because we have a natural negativity bias as human beings, that we
Yeah.
tend to spot what's bad. You've probably heard, some of the emotion scientists say the human brain is like Velcro for the negative and like Teflon for the positive. So the
Ooh,
negative just kind of sticks to us, and the
yeah.
positive just seems to slip off. So to begin with, spotting your strengths, believe it or not, is kind of a really, really big piece of work in and of itself to begin with. And then the sort of idea of towing that you're talking about is when you think of a strength that's quite low in your stack. It's kind of something that isn't very natural to you. It's a bit of a reach for you. So
Yeah.
for me, that strength would be bravery in certain situations. You think about what strength comes naturally to me, and how could I use that to supplement some of these strengths that are a bit more difficult. So for me, learning is my kind of top strength. It's one of the ones I absolutely go for, as you would imagine, as an academic. And it's amazing how brave I can be if I can convince myself there's some learning in it. Yeah, this is a difficult conversation. Yeah, that's a hard debate to take. Yeah, it feels like this is going to be a hard article to write and will bring some controversy with it. But hey, let's just do some learning and let's see what happens. And then other people say that was really brave. And I'm like, I'm not aware of being brave. I was just aware of
Wow.
learning. And so it's kind of thinking what comes naturally to you, and how do you use that to sort of leverage what might be lower down and a bit more of a bigger reach.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you mentioned bravery. Actually, it's funny that that's just your personal example, but we talk a lot about the character strength of bravery in our work, because one of my sort of, I don't want to say biggest fears, but a concern I have is that people come through the museum and we present them with the character strengths, and so they can look through them and say what resonates for me, or which ones, without the benefit of being able to take the full survey in the museum right in the moment, just spotting what they feel is essential to them. And I think, one of my concerns is that people are going to say, oh, well, I don't have bravery. I'm not a brave person. So like this upstanding stuff, this isn't for me. Like this isn't something that I'm going to do. And what we try to do is help people understand that actually, you know, your unique matrix of strengths, whatever they are essential, because there isn't another matrix like that. Like
Yeah,
you have this unique opportunity and quality and combination of these strengths that the world very much needs, right? And that yes, often in the case of upstanding, if we think about it in its most sort of classic sense, which is about harnessing the courage to stand up, speak out, advocate, push back on something, that does require a sense of bravery.
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean you have to be brave. It doesn't mean that has to be a natural thing for you. Have other people? Can you talk a little bit more about that? Have you worked how you've worked on that in yourself more, or if you've seen that phenomenon in other people and how they've sort of channeled that?
Yeah.
Because I think that's really essential.
Well, what you're talking about in a lovely way there is the way of what do we do with a character strength that feels like a bit of a reach for us? It feels like I couldn't do that. I couldn't stand up like that. I couldn't stand in honesty and integrity in that way. I couldn't persist. Those kind of questions. And the thing that I've noticed is that sometimes when a character strength like bravery is quite low, sometimes that in itself can be a strength. So let me give you an example from me. So the fact that physical bravery tends to be quite low for me, it means that in many social contexts, if I feel a little bit shy, a little bit sort of nervous to be there, I will find myself connecting with people on the outskirts of the situation rather than going to the middle of it. Then I make connections with people who perhaps wouldn't have been spoken to, or maybe a bit marginalized, were lacking a sense of connection. And then before I know it, I've sort of actually used what I thought was a low character strength and a bit of a weakness has become this incredible strength in terms of actually connecting with other people. And then I will find that when other people observe me doing that, they say, "You're so good at talking to strangers. How did you do that?" And in my head, I was just avoiding it, talking to the important people at the center
Ah,
of the event.
oh,
Um, and so I think there is a sense of whenever you express your character strengths, and you're right, there are more combinations of character strengths than there are people on the planet. So, we each have our unique fingerprint of strengths to express. In via character strengths terms, we would call them our signature strengths, those unique things we have to give. And whenever we use them, there is a sense in which we're being courageous. We're saying basically, this is the part of me that matters most, and I'm going to push that ahead of myself in spite of all the other things that might come along with it.
yeah. Yeah, I'm going to hold tight to that, that analogy of thinking about your weakness as a strength or as a potential strength. I think it's a great example of sort of, how your lack of bravery actually put you in a position to, to be brave in a way, or to be helpful and to contribute in a way of upstanding. Um, can you talk a little bit more about how, so we've talked a lot about sort of the inner individual and intrapersonal work, but much of your work is grounded also in the interpersonal,
Yeah.
um, how these character strengths can help us individually, but also they benefit our communities and social networks, and how these uh, good ripples can carry through social networks, and what the impact of that is. Speak a little bit to sort of the societal aspects of your work.
Yeah. I have to say that's always been a concern of mine. So when I think, even back in the days when I was a clinician doing one in, one out, I always had this sense of I want this to make a difference to the world in some way. There has to be a societal difference that comes with it. And that's one of the things that drew me to character strengths, is that suddenly you're talking about something that isn't just, it can be therapeutic, it can be coaching, but it can also be educational. It can be something that you teach whole groups. So I, for example, take about 100 undergraduate students every year through all 24 VIA character strengths. How do we define them? What do they do for us? What are the evidence-based interventions that mean we can develop them in some way? And it goes down great. And in fact, just last week, I got a message from a student of mine who said they've just got a place on a clinical psychology training course. And I don't even remember them. And they were saying, "We just want to thank you for inspiring me," while I was at
Oh my
university.
gosh.
And I don't even remember meeting her, but there you go. But one of the things that character strength does really well in terms of the ripple effect is that there's a very, very reliable finding with character strengths that basically says that if you use your signature strengths in a new way every day, so whatever comes naturally to you, it's effortless, it's energizing, you feel like it's essentially you. You couldn't be any different, really. And they're usually the sort of top 5, 6, 7 strengths that we have. Some of those. that what comes out pretty reliably when you look at meta-analyses, so studies that have been done on this,
Right.
that people who wake up in the morning and go, how do I use my strengths today? What one thing will I do today that uses my strengths? Is that very reliable? It increases their levels of positive emotion. So they're much more likely to
Wow.
be hopeful, joyful, peaceful, patient, uh, serene, that those levels of positive emotion are likely to go up. And not only does that do them individually good, it also seems to do everybody they meet that day good as well. So we know, for example, if you spend 20 minutes in the morning doing loving kindness meditation, thinking good things about yourself and the world around you, that the people you meet that day will report a slight uptick in their well-being. And then
Wow.
weirdly, the people they meet that day will report a slight uptick in their well-being. And there's even some evidence that it may even go 3 places removed. It gets a bit slight and gets a bit difficult to measure. But there's this sense of the people who meet us and the people they meet actually benefit from the fact that we're in that place. And one of the easiest ways to raise our levels of positive emotion is to think, what are my strengths and how can I use them today?
Wow, that is really powerful. It's something I'm not as conscious of in sort of my day to day, but it empirically tracks, right? Like when you talk about that, I think I'm thinking about my own, what my mornings are like, and if I set an intention, and if I'm thinking about where I know I have a part of my day that I'm really going to be able to sing, right? And I'm excited about that, and I'm thinking about what that's going to be like, and then I get there and it's great, or it maybe isn't as great as I think, but I'm
Yeah,
still sort of in my, as you said, in that essential place of myself, and the way other people respond to that, and how it encourages them and sort of charges them. And so the
yeah,
charging effect and the kinetic energy that ripples out from there is really powerful. It's really
yeah,
powerful. And the fact that it's not just, like foo foo, right? This is like scientifically studied that this is an actual phenomenon,
yeah,
that's statistically significant that occurs. You know, this is how change happens. And sometimes I think it's really easy to get bogged down. And we were talking the enormity of the world's problems and how small we all are in comparison, but what we do every moment really does matter, because it impacts through our
yeah,
networks the way other people feel they can live in their strength.
yeah.
Yeah, it is really powerful. um are there any specific stories that sort of illustrate that would you would want to share, where you've seen that phenomenon play out powerfully?
So, given that I've just finished my research on coaching officers in prison, that's
I
actually
figured
quite a
you
good
might talk
place to
about,
go.
yeah, perfect.
Yeah, and believe it or not, the people we did the research for, the sort of prison authorities we were doing it for, have come back to us saying, "Can you now come and study the ripple effect?" So our next project is literally called the ripple effect. That's what we're going to study. So there we go.
Okay,
Lots
well,
of
we're gonna have you on again
synchronicity.
to talk about the
Yeah,
ripple effect study that you're doing,
yeah,
when you have some results to report on that.
yeah. But what we were noticing is we were noticing how say one coaching intervention from somewhere where they're getting someone to identify their strengths and use them in action rippled all over the prison. So you'd not just over the prison. So you'd have senior officers talking about how they got into less conflict with junior officers, and then those junior officers feeling more supported in the way they dealt with the prisoners. You had people who were taking it home and then with their significant other, repeating the process with their significant, I've spotted my
Wow.
strengths today. Should we do yours too? And they start looking at that. Then we had a ripple effect going up the way where people who felt encouraged and felt like they had something to contribute would then think, actually, there's a policy issue in UK prisons. I really want to speak. Whose door should I knock on? What email should I
Mm,
send? And we have concrete examples of people actually changing pieces of policy as a result of them being coached and identifying their strengths and thinking,
wow.
I can use this in some way. And one of the things that I find very heartening about all those kind of results, and we still have to study them more and look at them in more depth, exactly what's going on. But what's really encouraging about that is that sometimes there's a critique of sort of positive psychology that says this is very individualistic. It's just about making people
Right.
feel better. And I would stand with you guys really in the sense of saying, no, I actually think this is an issue that is for society. It's for our culture. It's much wider. So it's not just about me feeling good. It's like if I feel joyful, peaceful, excited, hopeful, that immediately conveys to the next person. And just to say, when you look on research on things like kindness, on hope, on peace, um, on compassion, over and over again, a very similar kind of effect is observed. That it's not just about how the individual feels; it knocks on physiologically. You don't even have to tell people about it. It sort of knocks on physiologically into all the people around them.
Yeah, it's powerful, and I do see it. I was thinking about I was on my way here today, Starbucks, going through the Starbucks, and I was literally multitasking with like a billion different things. I don't even know. I think I was like putting my makeup on, all kinds of things they tell you not to do at once. And I just was like, I have a feeling that this woman who's going to hand me this cup of coffee, like, could connect with me about that. So I just like kind of lived into this place of like, the interpersonal strengths that I had. And we kind of like, talked and laughed about it. And I just looked at her at the end and I was like, you're making a difference. Like what you tell everybody who comes to this line, it sets the tone for the rest of their day. It matters. And she was like, oh, you're going to make me cry saying that. So it really is about, I think, just, but that started from a place of like, instead of thinking about this moment as a vulnerability, right? Here I am juggling a bunch of different things. I'm just going to think about it as a way to connect with somebody else and as a strength. And so, yeah, I think it's totally anecdotally bears
Mm.
resonates for me.
Shall I say something else about it? Because
Yeah,
the other
yeah, yeah.
thing that makes this even further is that once you have that sort of positive energy, if you like, rippling through a social system, there's then really, really fascinating research on very, very concrete outcomes that can occur in workplaces, for example, if there
Mm,
is more of that positive energy. So things like fewer sick days. If people are sick, they're back quicker,
mm,
higher motivation, more likelihood for people to collaborate rather than conflict with one another, better decision making. I've done quite a lot of research, for example, on dentists, getting them to improve their mood so that they can make better clinical decisions.
uh,
And this list just goes on and on. It's absolutely fascinating, and all of those things are measurable, and all of them seem to be associated with a greater level of positive affect knocking around in a
wow.
social system.
Yeah, it's really illuminating and validating, I think, as we all go do the rest of our day wherever we are today listening to this, thinking about leaning into those good things and setting that intention. And while before we might have done it just because, like, well, it feels good or it seems like the right thing to do, now knowing that there's actual science behind the fact that
Mhm.
downstream that does amazing things
Yeah.
is even more energizing to continue to sort of be more intentional. um, I'm so appreciative for the time you've spent today, whatever time it is, what's many hours ahead there, um, in this conversation, and just for the work that you do every day. I want to end just by asking you if, what are two or three things that the people who are listening to this right now can do when they put their phone down that could change their day, could change their world or their community, through sort of the lens of your work? Are there three
Yeah.
things you would hope that someone would take away from this and could implement quickly?
Yes. So there are some brilliant evidence-based practices people can take. First one I would suggest is something called strength priming. So strength priming, this is the answer that I give to executives if I'm coaching them and they say, I've got a difficult meeting, what should I say? And I go, it's not what you say, it's how you see the person you're about to meet will make the difference. And strengths priming is basically the idea, if you have a meeting with someone, it might be someone you like, might be someone who's quite difficult, just spend 5 minutes before you meet them thinking about what's good about them. What are their strengths? What do they contribute to you? Those kind of things. And the evidence is that that leads to all kinds of really, really good outcomes for other people. We'll be more engaged. We will be more creative in the way we deal with them. That they will go away feeling better about themselves as well.
Mm.
There's even research done with psychologists that say that psychologists who did that before meeting their clients, they found 20 weeks later, versus control, the psychologists did that, their clients had done better as a result
Oh,
of that sort of
wow.
strength priming. So, strength priming, really simple. If I've got a difficult meeting at work, I'll do it in 2 minutes walking down the corridor. The other thing that I love is there's a whole sort of research on the idea of strengths feedback. In other words, how you describe other people's strengths to them. But let me just give you a twist on that, is that what I've noticed is that the thing that seems to make the biggest difference to the culture of our workplaces, our social systems, our neighbors, isn't so much what we say to them, it's what we say about them behind their back. So I would argue, where could you positively gossip about somebody today? Instead of moaning
Positively.
about what they've done wrong or what you didn't like, where could you go? Wasn't that person creative? Weren't they kind? Weren't they exciting? Where can you do that? And particularly do it with people you might be struggling with a little bit, because you will sometimes find that that will be enough just to tip that relationship into something that feels a bit better.
Okay, so you can just rest assured that I am going to send all kinds of ripple effect waves of positive gossip at you for the rest of the day today. I'm going to be telling everybody about, man, I had this amazing conversation this morning, and what an incredibly brave person, even though you don't think you are, to be doing this work during a time when it feels pretty dark out there, and inspiring so many people. So thank you again for taking time to shed this light for us to um, create more ripples in the universe and in our world, and all the way across the pond. Really, truly appreciate you, Dr. Roger Bretherton. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you so much.
Our thanks to the Marison Family Foundation and the VIA Institute on Character for supporting this series. We have a link in the show notes so you can take your own free character strengths survey and learn more about your strengths. We'd love to hear about your experiences with character strengths and how you're using them to stand up. You can reach us anytime by email, and you can listen anytime on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or visit holocaustandhumanity.org/podcast. You can also connect with us on Instagram and TikTok at Holocaust and Humanity, and X and Facebook at CincyHHC. The Upstander Ripple Effect is a production of the Nancy and David Wolf Holocaust and Humanity Center. This series is part of the Cynthia and Harold Gutman Family Center for Storytelling. Visit us in person at Historic Union Terminal in Cincinnati, Ohio, or online at holocaustandhumanity.org. Executive producers are David Wise and Jackie Congedo. Managing producer is Ann Thompson. Consulting producer is Joyce Kamen. Technical producer is Robert Mills. Technical director is Josh Emerson. Opening sequence is by Ken Furman. Select music is by Kick Lee. And this is recorded at Technical Consulting Partner Studios in Cincinnati, Ohio.